Hello and welcome to the Independence live broadcast responding to Prime Minister's questions, which I watched with my colleague Andy Grice. I'm John Rentoul and Andrew Grice is with me, although I can't see him. Are you there, Andrew?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, yes, I can see you now. Lovely. I was expecting more from Prime Minister's questions today, I have to say, but it was a scratchy, inconclusive and unsatisfactory business. Keir Starmer asked 4 questions about testing, but they were rather odd questions, not very specific. They were about the strange wording that Boris Johnson used in the House of Commons yesterday, and then tacked on 2 questions about the unwinding of the furlough scheme at the end, and really made no progress on any of them.
Yes, I think one of the problems was, of course, that Boris Johnson did make a long common statement yesterday, and there were lots of exchanges between him and Keir Starmer. So this was a kind of repeat performance, only 24 hours after the main event, and that's always difficult. So perhaps with hindsight, Keir Starmer should have scrapped his questions on test and trace, which were picking up on a rather sort of dancing on the head of a pin argument from yesterday, and gone in hard on the economy. I think the main takeaway from Prime Minister's questions today was really that the government's got a presentational problem. They've announced further restrictions on the economy, which clearly are going to hit the hospitality sector very hard and have an impact on city centres, just as they're struggling to get back on their feet, without the support measures that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is now going to have to bring in. And they're a bit out of sync on that. Now, I don't think it's tenable for the Chancellor to wait until his budget in November. I think he's going to have to scramble something together pretty soon. All we got from Boris Johnson today were platitudes about creative ideas, and Rishi Sunak said something similar last week, but they need to come up with them pretty damn quick. Otherwise, there's going to be too much emphasis on the public health emergency without tackling the economic emergency that clearly is upon us.
Yeah, absolutely. And if Keir Starmer had asked a question like that, explaining it in those sort of terms to people, I think he would have made more of an impact. But instead, he seemed, I thought, at the end, to be suggesting that the government should just carry on with the furlough scheme, which, I think he said something like, don't withdraw furlough, which is contrary to the approach that the Labour Party has been following all along, which is, you need to extend the furlough scheme in some sectors which are particularly hard hit, but that you've got to move over to actually supporting people in work rather than supporting people for not working.
Yeah, I think that Keir Starmer does support a sectoral approach. Labour has admitted in recent days and did at its virtual conference that the furlough scheme couldn't continue as it currently is. Clearly, it's very expensive. And unfortunately, there are people on furlough who don't have jobs to go back to, so-called zombie jobs. But I think there is a consensus emerging for a shift towards a German-style approach where people who are working short-time or part-time would have their wages paid by their employer if they worked 2 days a week, for example, and the government would pick up their wages for the other 3 days of the week. That there seems to be a consensus amongst the CBI, the TUC, all heading in that direction. So I suspect that's where Rishi Sunak will end up, although he'll be very worried about the cost. Clearly, he's got an eye on trying to say in his November budget how he can balance the nation's books in the medium term. And this further injection of support to the economy in the emergency, the health emergency, is going to make that much harder to achieve.
That's right. But the problem is that Labour's worried about the cost as well, because they don't want to appear to be just advocating unlimited spending. I mean, Annalisa Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor, in her speech to Labour's sort of virtual conference, was very keen to emphasise how careful Labour would be with public money. And I thought that's what led to Keir Starmer's message being somewhat muffled in his final 2 questions today.
Yes, that's right. I think you had a clearer pitch for the furlough to be extended from Ian Blackford, the SNP leader at Westminster. And Labour's line didn't come over quite so clearly today. I do think the exchanges between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson were quite spiky. I thought Starmer was more supportive yesterday, where clearly he did not want to be accused of not supporting the individual measures the government is now taking, such as closing pubs and restaurants at 10 o'clock at night. Whereas today he went more aggressive, as he did in his conference speech yesterday, where he said very starkly that Boris Johnson was not up to the job of Prime Minister, which is further than he's before. It was interesting today that the Prime Minister repeatedly accused Keir Starmer of not supporting the government. I think the Conservatives see a way of undermining the pitch, the patriotic pitch, the pitch on the values of those working class voters who shifted to the Tories last October in the red wall of former Labour seats now turned blue. I think that the Team Boris sees a way of undermining that patriotic pitch by accusing Labour of not supporting the government in this national emergency. So Keir Starmer, rather like Boris Johnson himself, also has a difficult balancing act.
Yeah, absolutely. And was very prickly about being accused of not supporting hardworking NHS staff, saying, you know, his wife worked for the NHS and all that. But that's the problem. That it is that if Labour is going to criticise the test and trace system, then Boris Johnson's going to throw it back to them as suggesting that the people who are operating the test and trace system are not doing a good enough job, which it doesn't work for me. But, you know, perhaps, as you say, it works in a sort of general way of just suggesting that the Labour Party is nitpicking and carping.
Yeah, I think Keir Starmer is actually on the side of most people, particularly parents, and he did play that up today, accusing Boris Johnson of being out of touch. We know that Test and Trace did not anticipate the inevitable problems of children going back to school this month, and the coughs and colds that they're bound to get at this time of year. And we all know people in that boat. I've got family members in that situation. And I think that the government did look a bit out of touch on that, frankly, and in not anticipating that a lot of people would suddenly be demanding tests. And the government has got to be careful not to blame the people for either demanding tests or, as Boris Johnson hinted at last night in his TV address, not sticking to the rules when people are obviously very confused about the rules. And that's the government's fault, not the people's.
Yes, although, I mean, what I thought was fascinating about Boris Johnson's address yesterday, in effect blaming people for the resurgence of the virus, is that there is some opinion polling which suggests that actually public opinion blames other people, presumably not. It's never the person who's being asked the questions, but people seem to be prepared to blame other people rather than the government for a second wave of the virus. So maybe Boris Johnson is in tune with public opinion on that.
Yeah, I think he's got a problem, actually, because I think that back in March, 6 months ago today, the first lockdown was announced. People then gave the government the benefit of the doubt. There was a genuine sense of national unity about how to tackle this virus. I think that has melted away, unfortunately. And I think part of the reason for that is that the government has had so many mixed messages. We've had so many changes of rules that even people like you and me are sometimes confused about what they are. And certainly, you know, I would struggle to draw a map of the UK's 4 nations and say, well, which rules apply where? And I spend half my waking hours poring over the rules. So it's very difficult. It's very confusing. And all the changes that have been made, and I think we're going to go through it again. I think that Boris Johnson's measures announced yesterday were not really in sync with the very grim warnings from his scientific and medical advisors on Monday, whereas Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland does appear to have taken action, such as the ban on 2 households meeting indoors, that is more in tune with the scientific advice. So a lot of MPs, and I think ministers privately now, expect that England will come into line with Scotland eventually. So, there was an argument that the same Boris Johnson should have done that yesterday. Clearly, he didn't want to do that. And one reason was that would have met with an angry backlash from his own Tory backbenchers. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. Only a matter of time on that. What did you make of Boris Johnson's final answer to Keir Starmer, his answer to Keir's 6th question? So he knew that Keir Starmer could respond. And the Prime Minister quoted Kate Green, the Shadow Education Secretary, who was saying in I think a Zoom meeting of party activists that the Labour Party mustn't let a good crisis go to waste. What did you make of that as a underhand political tactic?
It was a clever trick, and he knew full well, as you say, that Keir Starmer didn't have a seventh question, therefore couldn't reply to it. Labour has disowned Kate Green's remarks. She know that she misspoke. I don't think she meant it, but clearly in hard print, in black and white, it looks terrible. It looks as though Labour is doing exactly what Boris accused Keir Starmer of doing today, which was to play an opportunistic game with this crisis, which Labour cannot afford to do, and is not doing. You know, it's supporting the individual measures, as we just said. But yes, it was underhand, but I think just about within the rules. And both leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister often use their last question to do that. Of course, the Prime Minister has a slight advantage because he does literally have the last word.
Yeah, absolutely. What surprised me, of course, was that Kate Green hadn't actually apologised for that yesterday. I mean, it was left to Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who was asked about it in a TV interview. And she apologised on behalf of the Labour Party. But I think the Labour Party ought to have moved yesterday to try to close that story down. Yeah,
I think they would have done if it had been running bigger. I mean, I saw Lisa Nandy's interview, and when she was confronted with it directly, she did run a mile from it, as Labour would have to do, but it wasn't running, and we've had so many other issues running on coronavirus issue. It wasn't really a big story, so maybe they thought it was best to leave it alone rather than draw attention to it. They always have to make those judgments in media land, as you know.
Yeah, it was a busy day yesterday. But I mean, the problem with that was, you know, although she may have meant it lightly or as a joke, it does have echoes of you know, it being now a good day to get out news we want to bury, as Joe Moore said in the wake of 9/11.
That's true. Yes, it wasn't a good look for Labour. But I think, you know, Labour's reply would be to say, look, we are supporting the government. We are supporting their individual measures while retaining the right to criticise the overall strategy. And that's what Keir Starmer was doing today. I thought he was more critical today than he was yesterday, but it's within his rights to do that. And I think he is painting quite a dangerous narrative of the government, one of incompetence, which also is the first first plank in Keir Starmer himself building a platform for the next election. We will be more competent than the Conservatives. And I do think the constant changes in the rules, you know, that picture, if you combine that with test and trace, the conflicting advice on working from home, for example, you know, it does add up to a picture that does look incompetent. And so, you know, Labour will, I think, continue to get that message over.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, those charges of incompetence and responding too slowly to events are absolutely deadly, because they're very difficult to repudiate, because you know, that's the media coverage is going to follow those kind of themes constantly, and it's very difficult for a government to once the perception has gained ground out there that it's behind events, it's sort of always reacting to things too late. It's very difficult for a government to turn that round.
Yeah, I think Boris Johnson may rue the fact that he didn't go further yesterday. I mean, if, as you and I both expect, England does have to go further and be brought into line with Scotland, stopping people from different households meeting indoors, then Boris will have missed an opportunity yesterday to do that in one go, rather than come back in a couple of weeks' time when the figures on coronavirus infections don't improve. If that's what happens, then it would look as though he'd not learned the lesson from back in February, March, where everyone now thinks we locked down perhaps 2 weeks too late. So he has got a second chance, but I just wonder whether he rather blew it yesterday.
Yeah, good point. We shall see if he ends up thinking he's fumbled it. Thanks very much, Andy. That's very interesting, and we hope to repeat this performance next week. Thanks for joining us, everyone.